If you were born in this land, I advise you to learn to bow before the sandstorm. Otherwise, you will have to learn to shoot before the wind blows. The wind blew as if the earth were cursing every living thing that dared survive on the southern edge of Arizona. Clouds of red dust hung like ghosts, clinging to the cliffs as if trying to hide something that was not meant to be known. And it was there, in the middle of a land that maps didn't bother to name, that Jake Callahan did what no one else dared to do. He looked up, not to challenge the heavens, but to see clearly the face of what people call destiny. The town of Dry River knew Jake was tough, and tough to kill. They called him Widow Cowboy after the night of the campfire, when he emerged from the ashes with nothing but a Winchester and a blank stare. Since then, he has lived on the edge of Coyote Gulch, where wolves are afraid to set foot. For 3 years, Jake had not been back to town unless he really needed bullets or salt. They said he had a grudge against people, but the truth was Jake had a grudge against fate. Weakor because it had taken everything away without explanation. His wife, the child he had never held, the future he had foolishly believed was his. And then, one July afternoon, as the sun turned toward dusk and the wind began to hiss like a cobra, he heard it, a sound that should not have been made in the dead land. A scream as soft as a breath, but enough to make his hand tighten on the stock of his gun. Jake didn't ask why. A man who had lost everything had nothing left to hesitate about. He turned his horse into the bush, where dry-burning sage stabbed into his trousers like steel needles, and where fate awaited him once more in the form of a wounded Apache girl. She lay there, her small body trembling under the mesquite, her eyes wide and alert, and not a hint of pleading. Her clothes were torn, her hair red with dust, her eyes like two unburned embers. She did not complain, did not cry. She just looked at Jake as if to ask herself, "Are you part of the pursuit or a stray in the sins of others?" Jake said nothing. He just nodded, then knelt down, pulled out the canteen and handed it to her. Her hands trembled as she touched the tube, but her eyes were still boring questions into every pore of his face. "I'm not the government. I don't arrest people," Jake said, "and if anyone's after you, they'll have to go through my dead body first." Prejudice once again tried to turn Jake Callahan's wheel, but this time, it didn't meet a fallen man. He met a skinny cowboy, a gun strapped to his hip, the calluses on his hands of someone who had built his house with sweat, but the fire in his heart of someone who would accept no one's arrangement, not even God. Tane. That night, as Jake dressed the girl's wound by the light of a kerosene lamp and heard her say her name was Nia, he knew that a new chapter had just begun in his life. Not because of love, a luxury Jake could not dream of, but because he had finally found something worth not turning back from again. Fate may pursue him, it may burn his farm, it may take his family, but if it wants to take this girl, Nia, it will have to step into Jake Callahan's land, a place where, man or demon, you must see the glint of a gun before you speak the rules. Nia, as Jake dressed the girl, because there are people who are born to go with the wind, to found, Margus lace, and there are people like Jake Callahan, Nia, born to break fate with their own hands. If fate wants to come here, it will have to go through my blood to leave. Jake Callahan was not used to the presence of others in the old cabin where the sandstone cracked every inch of the desert sun. Yet for 3 nights in a row, he heard soft breathing from the extra bed, and it didn't bother him. Even on the 4th night, when Nia groaned softly from the pain under the bandage, Jake put his coffee cup on the table, stood up, and gently placed his calloused hand on her forehead like a husband would do to his wife. Nia didn't ask him anything, didn't ask why he was alone, didn't ask why his eyes always looked far away into the desert, as if searching for something buried deep. And Jake didn't ask her a word about her past, didn't press her to tell him why an Apache girl had been left in the bushes with swollen legs and bruises around her wrists. They lived quietly, like 2 wild animals pausing on the same stream, not stalking, not fearing, but not yet trusting each other. Nia recovered slowly but steadily. She swept the floor with one hand, picked sage and yucca from the hills, boiled water to brew pungent herbs. Jake didn't like tea but drank it anyway. For the first time in years, he didn't have to eat alone. Underestimated much, but when she first wrinkled her nose when he burned the cornbread, Jake felt his chest shatter from the inside, not painfully, but as if someone had just unlocked the door to a warehouse full of memories he'd locked away long ago. One night, as the red moon rose over the horizon like the eye of a wild beast watching from afar, Naya stepped out onto the porch, wrapping an old blanket around her shoulders. She sat down beside Jake, saying nothing, not touching him. But as the wind picked up, she leaned her head back and lightly touched his shoulder, a silent message. And for the first time, Jake didn't push away. The next morning, Jake checked the north fence. Beneath the dust, he found strange boot prints, bigger than ranchers, deep, purposeful. Not native, not a trader. Those were the footsteps of someone paid to find someone. When he returned, he didn't tell Nia. He just quietly pulled the Winchester's magazine back and bolted the back door with an old oak log. But she knew. Somehow her eyes changed when she saw him wiping the gun with the oilcloth. No questions, no objections, just, they won't stop, not until they have me or blood. Jake curled his lips, smiling curtly for the first time. Then let's not make it your blood. That afternoon, when Jake returned from his visit to the river, he found Nia unpacking the old trunk under his bed. No rush, no fear. When he walked in, she didn't hide, didn't panic. In her hand was an Apache dagger, its silver hilt engraved with the warrior symbol. "I won't run anymore," she said. "If they come, I'll stand beside you, not behind you." Jake stood still. He watched the girl he once thought was a victim, now a small but unbowed warrior. And in that moment he understood. It was fate that had brought her here not to be saved, but to join him in fighting against the thing that life wanted to make them submit to. The paradox is there. Conjess thought he was saving her, but she is turning him into the man fate thought it had killed long ago. Fate was a wind. Then that evening, it began to blow through the crack in the door, with carrying the sound of horse hooves echoing from the eastern horizon. The hunter has arrived, and Jake Callahan is ready to answer. Flush, the wind blew from the east. A cold that did not belong in July crept through the valley like a warning from the heavens. Jake Callahan knew this wind. It brought not rain, but evil. That afternoon, he found another set of boot prints along the south fence, parallel organized. Not hunters, not salt traders, horse prints, closely spaced, broad like mercenaries, soldier boots but without the uniform. Jake knelt down and pulled a dry chewing stick from his pocket, unlit. His lips tightened. "You three," he muttered. "Straight ahead. No ducking. No dodging. You're hunting someone you think is weaker." When he returned to the cabin, it was not yet quite dark, but the shadow of danger lay long on the threshold. Naya was sharpening her knife, not because she was afraid, but because she knew this day would come. Jake placed the sand and footprints on the wooden table, then sat down, his eyes looking straight at her. "They're close. They're close." Friendship stopped, her hands shaking slightly, but her eyes didn't. She looked up, letting out a long breath as if she had been waiting for this moment her whole life. "It's time you knew," she said. And then, like a whirlwind blowing away the sand that covered a secret, Nia told. She is not just an Apache girl lost in the desert. She is the matriarchal daughter of the Chaconan bloodline, a direct descendant of one of the last warriors to ride alongside Geronimo. A government delegation arrived in her village, bearing flags, guns, and orders to relocate. A phrase as soft as silk, but with chains and traps inside. They promised land, water, medicine, but at night they tied up the men, herded the women into wagons, and locked the children in animal crates. Nia knew that if she was caught, she would be imprisoned as living proof of a treaty that no one wanted to sign. But she escaped, jumped from a truck in the dark, broke her ankle, ran through 40 miles of hellish sand and cactus. She wasn't meant to live, but fate wouldn't let her die. Instead, it pushed her toward a scarred, compassionate cowboy who survived. "They call it relocation. I call it removal," Nia said, her eyes cold as steel. Jake clenched his fists, remembering what used to be the law in this part of the world. Trading an Apache village for the peace of the subway. Sending people like Nia away was a way to clean up history. Minimized, Jake pulled an old wooden table across the front door. On the table were two guns, the Winchester he'd used as a young man and an old pistol that had belonged to his late wife. Didn't cry. She just took a small pouch from her leather hip pouch, took out a silver coin engraved with the Apache symbol, and placed it on the windowsill. For luck? Jake asked. No, for memory, in case they win. She replied, her eyes never leaving the desert. When Jake returned, she was sitting by the oil lamp, sharpening her knife one last time. He looked at her for a long moment, then sat down across from her. You could run again, he said softly. I could, but if I run now, I run forever, Naya Deloy. Then we stand, Jake affirmed. Jake took a small wooden box from the floor. He hadn't opened it since the house burned down. Inside was a silver badge, U.S. Marshal Jake Callahan, along with a family photo blackened by smoke. Naya looked at him, as if seeing clearly for the first time. You were one of them? She asked, her voice not angry, just silent. I was justice once. Then I saw what they did with it. Jake replied, then threw the badge into the fireplace. Ty, now I choose who deserves protection. And just as the coals began to glow under the old badge, there came the sound of horses' hooves from the east, clean, rhythmic, like a death drum. Fate no longer knocked at the door. It rode straight to the porch. But this time, Jake and Naya don't wait to be judged. They chose to defy fate, even if it meant shooting it through the heart to keep their freedom. Before the morning sunlight had time to dry the frost on the cabin's metal roof, the sound of horse hooves rang out, heavy, steady, and cold, like a knock on the door of fate. Jake Callahan was standing on the porch, Winchester in hand, his back as straight as an old oak in the wind. Not a trace of fear. Naya stood behind the curtains, looking through the crack. Her face did not change color, but her hand tightened on the hilt of the knife under the cloth wrapped around her waist. They had said it last night. If today was the last day, they would not die in fear. Four gunmen appeared, riding horses across the red dusty road in front of the cabin like flesh and blood ghosts. The three men behind him wore dark leather jackets and had pistols at their sides, their faces as hard as the rocks of the West. But the one in the lead, he wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, and on his left cheek was a long scar that tore across like a bear's claw. He stopped right in front of the porch, glanced at the gun in Jake's hand, and smiled faintly. Jake Callahan, right? Jake didn't answer, just tilted his head slightly, as if in acknowledgement, as if in warning. We're looking for a little Apache. It was said to be headed this way. The air was as thick as gun oil. Jake replied in a voice as low and dry as valley sand. I don't see anyone, and you're standing on my land. The scarred man smiled, as if he had heard that 100 times from people who thought they could hide something. We're just doing our job. The government has the paperwork. She's part of the prison, a piece of property in transit. If you interfere, you're aiding and abetting a criminal. Jake raised the gun to his chest, not pointing straight, but enough to let the wind know the wind was changing. I don't care about paperwork. I only know the law of this land. My law. The mercenary took another step. His horse stomped, raising dust. Are you sure you want to die for a red Indian girl? Shuffled, that's when Nia stepped out. She stood in the doorway, eyes facing all four gunmen, her black hair blowing in the wind as bright as coal. The old scar on her forehead did not make her weak, but made her a symbol of survival for an entire nation. Stop, she said softly, but her voice was as sharp as a knife. Jake turned back, shaking his head, but she had already stepped off the porch. I'll go. Don't shoot. I don't want you to die because of me. Jake closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, his gaze was different. He turned to the four horsemen, his voice no longer low, but booming like thunder in the desert. She's not going anywhere. She's under my protection. The pursuers stopped. Jake's gun was now pointed at the scarred man's chest. You want her? You'll have to go through me. The scarred man narrowed his eyes, lowered his hand, and touched the gun stock at his hip. You willing to die for it, cowboy? And then, the sentence that made heaven and earth stop breathing rang out, not with a shout, but with a deep voice, as firm as a wooden nail hammered into a coffin. No. I'm ready to kill for her. Silent. Absolute silence. No birds chirped, no horses neighed. The whole desert held its breath, waiting to see who would blink first. The three mercenaries behind him looked at each other. Their hands hovered near the butts of their rifles, but none of them drew. They were mercenaries, not loyalists, not martyrs. They were paid to chase, not to die. The scarred man smirked, glanced at Jake one last time, then lowered his hand from the gun. Not worth it. Let's go. As the dust of horses cleared on the horizon, Jake lowered his gun. His hands shook slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of standing up to an entire system, an entire history, and living to tell the tale. Naya walked up to him, placing her slender hand on his. She didn't say thank you, because for her, today's freedom wasn't a gift. It was something she and Jake had earned with determination and unspent blood. And somewhere in the wind, fate understood that it had just lost a battle, not because of guns, but because of men who refused to kneel. As Jake sat down on the porch that night, with the gun set aside, and Naya leaning on his shoulder in silence, he didn't think about tomorrow. He only knew that today he had kept what fate wanted to take away. And for the first time in years, the ground beneath his feet was no longer cold. Take. After that day, no more strange horse hooves sounded on Jake Callahan's land. No more knocking on the door from the human-faced fate. And if anyone had passed the edge of Coyote Gulch a few weeks later, they would have seen a sight stranger than anything that had ever happened in that dusty, blood-soaked land. A man with a gun at his side, sitting, learning to distinguish wild mint from wormwood, and an Apache girl smiling with her eyes. Nia stay, Imogen and Jake didn't demand. They didn't name their relationship, didn't tie it to concepts like lovers or husband and wife. In a place where one could lose their life because of a misplaced glance, choosing to stay was already a vow as solid as a rock. Jake started waking up early, not because of the horses, but because Nia often went out to pick leaves at dawn, when the dew still hung on the rocks like unshed tears. She taught him how to make tea from tree bark. I used roots to cure fevers and read the wind by the way a sagebush tilted its head. He taught her to ride on her thighs, to shoot without aiming, and to read the language of wolves on moonlit nights. You look at the stars like a dead map, she once said. I look at the earth like it can talk, Jake said. Between them were two worlds, one burned, one robbed. But in the silence between their differences, they found the same breath. Jake no longer sits alone on the porch in the afternoon. Now there was a second figure, sleek, strong, leaning against him as if it had been there all along. As the twilight fell like fire across the rocks, Naya sat silently as Jake recounted the battles before he had given up his marshal's badge. As for Jake, he now listens attentively to Naya's stories about her ancestors, about the spirits of stone, water, and sand. Once she put her hand on his chest and said, "Your heart is not dead, Jake Callahan. It just needs soil to grow again." They don't say I love you. No one needs to. Love is in the way. Nia covers him when Jake falls asleep on the wooden chair. In the way Jake buttons the back of her shirt every morning before she goes out. Love was in the leather gloves he sewed himself to fit her small, strong hands, in the look he gave her when she spoke Apache to the birds. And he didn't understand a word, but found it beautiful. One day as Jake was putting a new bridle on his horse, Dusty, Nia came out from behind the cabin, a rolled-up leather tube in her hand. She said nothing, just handed it to him. Jake opened it. Inside was a hand-drawn map, marking the locations of medicinal plants, water sources, and shortcuts through the valley. "If I'm not here one day," she said, her eyes never leaving him, "subjected, you won't be lost anymore." Jake didn't answer. He just pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, as if he let go, everything they had held onto would vanish into the wind. A few years later, people told, there is a legend that lives in the Arizona desert about a cowboy who fought against the government to protect a girl no one considered valuable. Creer man once fired a warning shot into the sky to remind the world that not everyone bows their heads. Rassons walked out in front of 4 guns without trembling, not because she was not afraid of death, but because she had lived as if she were already dead. Visited the little house on the edge of the cliff, who have drunk tea boiled with cactus roots and heard soft laughter coming from the porch. No better. Undermine then is not just about courage or freedom. Two hearts, one once fallen, one once hunted, who together fought against fate and won. And every night as Jake and Naya sat together, watching the old stars drift across the western sky, they didn't count time in years. They counted it by the number of times the silence between them became so sacred that no words dared to intrude. For when love is born of resistance, of struggle, of blood and soil, it needs no words. It just lives. The town of Dry River has never been used to being different. It accepted the sound of a gun more readily than a gentle whisper, the flag of a government more readily than the look of an honest eye. And when word got around that an Apache girl was living with Jake Callahan, it was whispered from the tavern to the blacksmith shop. That girl, Kaepernick, probably someone he saved. Watch out, the authorities won't like it. Jake doesn't care what the authorities like. And I am standing used for a Jake Callahan. They probitious to where he wanching late. The crowning works period. Which man and Jake? Ake Shepherd Chief is psychology working with Apache. These shapes, and Derman was like a tie. They savior bound, and I offer this. If you find it. They say they're farmers. I sternly girl. And group innocences sacrifice the assigns to the massive. And girl was in rate. And the warding be fined to have. And Collinty. In Mare was a girl successfully, even wearing at N group's family. Which Manin going back to the sound of Dry River has exil his fishingly with man and girl. The sounds of Trine tell me about the time of Jake. And finally, which Manin shares together that Jake was coming immassively? Which Manin shares our public's treatment of fonsations? The recognizing of Bowian and demon loves. The Bowians are having himself. If your loves may have down, this catching was in lived at the Apache girl was liver from the Apache. And over to the NW day, a great night passion to very markety. Now she's a slender figure picking herbs by the stream, living in the home of a taciturn cowboy. People talk a lot, but no one dares to ask, because since the day the four gunmen retreated into the red dust, everyone knows. If anyone dares to come to Jake Callahan land without being invited, they will leave on 2 feet, or 6 planks of wood. Demolished like water wearing away stone, slow, but never stopping. The old house now had medicinal plant beds in the backyard, hanging herbs by the window, and a new wooden table that Jake had built himself, big enough for 2 people to eat together without having to squeeze shoulders. The children in the town, when they grew up, heard the story told as a nameless legend, no book recorded, no hymn sung. He saved her freedom. She saved his soul. Heartbeat, they said. For Rudko, she was once a shadow that ran away. Now she is the light that warms that dusty house. And Jake, from a man who never looked anyone in the eye, now knows how to laugh when he hears the wind knocking on the door. Misled, abandoned by the world, have found a small universe just enough for 2 souls to survive. No one knows when their love began. Some quarter. Some say it was the night Jake on the porch, the silver moonlight shining on eyes that had never known peace. Others say it was the moment Jake stepped forward to block the 4 guns and said he was willing to kill to protect her. But to anyone who has seen them silently making tea, planting trees together, or mending fences in 110-degree heat, they know love doesn't need to be declared, it just needs to be there. And so, a man who believed his life was over found a reason to open his eyes every morning. And a woman who had been hunted like a wild animal found a place where no one would hunt her anymore, except in the gentle gaze of that man. Not everyone who lives in the West is a hero. Not everyone who rides a horse and carries a gun is a murderer. And not all love needs to be certified, legalized, or sworn in front of a crowd. There are loves that silently resist the whole world, just by existing. Naya and Jake never left that land. They didn't need to, for where fate once came with swords and chains, now blooms sage and mint. When the first Wintachin was still seen rising from the roof of that little house, a sign that something was still alive. Not tradition, not bloodline, but hope. And the legend lives on, like sand that never fades in the wind. Bilingual, who said no to power. About a girl who said enough to destiny, and about a love that was born in the harshest of places, but bloomed stronger than anything else. People still ask me why I don't leave that land, because in this place I lost everything. But it was also here that I found everything that was most important. There are things that cannot be measured by clocks or maps, not time, not distance. Clang Mother, where two souls understand each other without a word. Every time the wind blew across the porch, carrying the scent of dried mint and red dust, I remembered the day I stood at gunpoint and said I would kill to protect her. Not because I was a hero, but because that was the first time I felt alive. If anyone asks what love is, I'll point to the little cabin at the end of the canyon, where a cowboy is no longer alone, and an Apache girl doesn't have to run anymore, where destiny has come and been rejected.